Hello. Thanks, Karen. I am Tim Hills, historian for McMenamins, and I'm really thrilled about this evening. It all kind of started when I was talking to my friend Mike Ryerson, who we've been doing interesting offbeat historical stuff for about 15 years now together. And I was just with him one time recently, or probably after the first of the year, just catching up on things, and I asked how Bud was doing, and started talking about Bud, and then we realized right now, this May is the 30th anniversary of his election. And we thought, my God, what a great opportunity to have him tell his story. And then we talked a little more and started talking to Bud. We weren't sure if he'd be interested. And then the idea kind of got bigger and better. Why not get his staff on board and have them be part of the program? And we never thought we'd get all these folks in one room. And I don't think, you'll have to ask them, but I don't think they've been in the same room for about 20 years, all of them. So this is really historic, and it's going to be so much fun. We're going to bring them all out here, and each will introduce themselves, tell what role they had in the campaign, and then there'll be a description of the political climate, basically the reasons that Bud wanted to get into this campaign in the late 70s, early 80s, by longtime political analyst and advocate of Bud's first campaign, Tim Hibbets, who we're really thrilled to have aboard too. And then he'll get rolling moderating the panel discussion, asking them all kinds of questions and get the conversations rolling. And then it's your turn to ask the questions. And we'll take whatever questions from the audience, and then we'll call it a wrap. How about that? All right, well, let's bring them out here then. Thanks very much.
Good evening. I'm Tim Hibbets. I was in both the 1984 and 1988 campaigns. I was Bud's pollster, part of the strategy team, and the chief skeptic about things. Delightfully, I was proven wrong. I want to start by giving you a little bit of picture of what things looked like in Portland politically at the end of 1983 and the beginning of 1984, so it will set the context for exactly what happened. Frank Ivancie was elected mayor in 1980. He defeated Connie McCready, who was appointed mayor when Neil Goldschmidt left the mayoralty to become Secretary of Transportation in the Carter administration. Mayor Ivancie defeated Ms. McCready pretty handily by about 11 or 12 points in the 1980 primary, became mayor. And for the bulk of his term, I think it would be fair to say he was rather feared by other politicians in the city and the county. A number of those folks took a look at running against him in 1984. Those included Charles Jordan, Mike Lindbergh, Pauline Anderson, Don Clark, the former Multnomah County chair, who had lost a Democratic primary for governor in 1982. And none of those people decided to step into the breach for one reason or another. One by one, they all stepped out. And the reality was, well, Mayor Ivancie was reasonably popular. He was by no means overwhelmingly popular and could have been challenged. I got into this rodeo pretty late. The campaign, I think, had been going for about 2 months, and I was certainly aware of the fact that there was a campaign against Mayor Ivancie, but I think it would be fair to say that I was not inclined to believe it was likely to be successful. And then I went to, I was invited, I do not remember who asked me to come to a meeting. It might have actually been Ernie Bonner, but whoever it was, they said, would you come over, we're interested in doing a poll on the race. And I was not, to put it diplomatically, a fan of Frank Ivancie's. So I thought anything that I could do to help out, even if it was to put it mildly, a long shot, would be a good way to go. So I went over there, and there were a number of folks, and those of you who may know me know I've been a pollster for almost 40 years, and I know most folks politically in the city and are reasonably well connected, and was in 1984. I went over and saw this group of people, and I thought, who are these people? I don't know any of them. And they said, well, what can you do for us? And I explained, here's what I can do. We can take a poll. We can look at messaging for you to talk to you about the things that might work message-wise, and how to present Bud, and to just get a sense of what the demographics of this race look like. And they said, well, that sounds pretty interesting. And then they said, well, tell you what, we're going to have a vote on whether to hire you. And I was in the room when they voted. It was very close. It was very close. I won by a narrower margin than it turns out that Bud did. The upshot is, we went out and did a poll, and keep in mind, at this point, we're 9 weeks ahead of the primary. This is not 6 or 8 months in advance. This is 9 weeks ahead of the primary. We went out and did a poll, and the head-to-head numbers in the poll showed Frank Ivancie 49%, Bud Clark 19%. But we asked a second question, and that question was, do you want to re-elect Frank Ivancie, or would you like to see him replaced by someone else? Now, we didn't say who the someone else was, but when we asked that question, it was Ivancie, re-elect him 48%, replace him 41%. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. Maybe we can make a race of this at least. The other thing we found out, we tested Bud's profile with voters, and it was overwhelmingly popular. Almost 75% of Portland voters said that this was the type of candidate who would have a great deal or a fair amount of appeal to them. And with that, away things went. I think it would be fair to say, I've got a friend here in the audience tonight. I'm not going to shame him by identifying him. He's a good friend, and we used to still do a lot of hiking together, and he will tell you that we went on many hikes during the course of that campaign, and every week or every 5 days we'd get together, I'd say that's 100 to 1. Yeah, it's 50 to 1. It's 25 to 1. It's 10 to 1. It's 5 to 1. And as we got closer and closer to the election, the thing tightened up more and more. So it was great fun at the end. My wife was at election headquarters on election night, and I was actually working at that time for Coin TV doing election night analysis and projections, and she called me with the initial returns, which already had Bud at 51%, and I went, holy cow. Bud went on to win by almost 12 points. In fact, almost 13 points. So with that, I want to kind of open it up to other folks and let them talk a little bit about what they did. But I was told that I had the power to cut people off if they talk too long, so I'm going to do that. Who wants to take the first shot?
Well, I'm going to say that I wouldn't have even thought about running for mayor, except Peter Nielsen was running for mayor, and I thought, well, hell, maybe I could beat him. Anyway, I took people, Ernie Bonner and David Kish came to me in May of 1984, or 83, excuse me, and talked to me about running for mayor. And I said, well, who in the hell would want that job? And then in the fall, and then I didn't even think about it. And then in the fall, Margaret Strawn and Gretchen Kafori came and asked me about running for mayor. And then I thought, well, I'll talk to my relatives and friends and so forth and see what they think. And then I confided in them about thinking about it. But then I forgot about it entirely until Christmas time. And from one of these relatives that I talked to, I got this present, and it said, "To the mayor with love." And I said, I thought somebody was going to run against Frank, but I didn't know for sure that anybody had. And so I called up Margaret Strawn, who lived a few blocks away, and she said nobody's running against Frank. I said, well, I'm going to do it then. And so Mike Ryerson and I went down. Well, anyway, I announced at the neighbor dinner, and we started the campaign, and then we're going to talk about how all these people came together, and I want to thank everybody how they came together. And that's really what I feel about tonight, is because it was the volunteers. It was the volunteers that came together and that got me elected. And it was the people working together that made it happen. So thank you all very much for being here.
Well, I just wanted to say it's a good thing you stopped there, but I was going to cut you off.
Got me all video.
I'm Mike Ryerson. I fell into the picture when Bud came to me and said that people had encouraged him to run for mayor. And I had owned the neighbor newspaper at the time. And we had, on 27th of December 1983, we had a dinner for the staff. Chuck Duffy, who's in the audience, was there, and Gordon Oliver was there. And Bud said to the staff, I'm going to run, they were freelance staff, said, I'm going to run for mayor. I remember Duffy in particular gave out a very loud cheer that night. 2 days later, Bud and I went down, I think it was, and we signed up. I had to drag him down there and let loose of the $50 he had to pay. What was the next one we were going to do there? Was it an introduction? You want an introduction from the other people?
Oh,
I think Mike should.
Absolutely, to speak now. Yeah.
Mike should be next.
Yeah, I'm Mike Carstensen. The day that they registered, my husband and I were at the Goose, as we often were, after work having a glass of wine. Bud came in and said, I filed today to be mayor. And he said, Phil Thompson just gave me $50, so I'm off and running, and I need a campaign manager. Well, I about 3 wines later, I had said, well, I can do that. And that's how we got going. And I had done some political work, but I certainly had never done any in Portland, and I was certainly, as Jim made clear, not well known in political circles. But it didn't take long to figure out that we could win this. We could win this race. And by getting all these wonderful people together and making it coffee cup to coffee cup and beer mug to beer mug, that's what we did.
I want to say, Tim, we didn't know who you were either.
No.
You're not the first person to say that.
Well, I was having a small party at my house on Germantown Road when I saw Bud announce on the 6 o'clock news. They did a little deal. And I said to all my friends, I had no idea who Bud was. I had never even stepped into the Goose, but I didn't like Frank Ivancie. I had some inner city, what do you call that, challenges with him. So a couple days later, I ran into Mike Carstensen, who was just a brand new friend, and she said she was going to be his campaign manager, and I said, oh, please ask me, I want to help. And that's how I got there.
And Carolyn led me around every place. Mike said, get this guy some speech lessons, first of all, and that's where Ben Padro came in. And he didn't want to be paid in money or, I don't know, expose himself to Frank or something, so he wanted to be paid in cigarettes, Territon cigarettes, so I paid him in cigarettes. Anyway, Mike, I had to learn how to speak better, so asked Carolyn to do these coffees. And Carolyn belonged to a bridge club, and she's got more damn friends than you ever want to believe all over town. And so I would go, and you'd have 5 or 10 people and talk, and the idea was I didn't have a campaign to I didn't have any issues at the time. I wasn't out there to change the government or anything, but these coffees gave me the issues. People were, they told me their problems and what they were worried about. And that time we had a big homeless problem. We had the police were looked at as the occupying army, and like they were more afraid of the police than they were of some of the criminals they were talking. Well, maybe it wasn't that extreme, but the point was everybody wanted to change the police department for them to get out of their cars and so forth. So that's where the idea of community policing came along and so forth, and then the homeless plan and that. And so all the issues came from the people. They came from you. They came from all the people that we talked to, and that's where what made it so successful, I think, down the line. But anyway, it was talking to the people that did it. So thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Mike, too, for being the campaign manager.
Well, and the deal is try calling on the phone people you've known for a very long time and saying, I want you to have a coffee for this guy. And they would say, well, who is he? And my comment was, you don't need to know who he is, you just need to give him a chance. Invite your neighbors, you'll be glad you did.
And see, all this time the media would not pay any attention at all. I tried to get their attention, but I put an ad in the Oregonian and nobody responded, and so I just forgot about that. I kept trying to get attention, but it just didn't happen. And then there's other things about it. Ben Padro, who's, I'm sorry, is not here. I mean, he passed away shortly after, some time ago. And I'm very sorry that Phil Thompson and Billy Holtz have both passed away too. And So there's some people missing that should
And
be
Bob
on the
McCracken,
counter,
too.
who was very good and helped with the campaign and made it happen.
Dan?
So in January 1984, I was busily trying to pull myself out of the discharge into my digestive system, and I got a call from Mike Kirstensen. Oh, I'm sorry. I've only got one working vocal cord, and that causes people to think that I'm only telling half truths.
Which would be much better than the average politician.
In any event, Mike called me in January and said I had known her since the Kennedy campaign in Southern Oregon in 1968. And she said, I've just volunteered as campaign manager for this guy, and I don't know if we can get him elected, but we're going to have a hell of a lot of fun. And I just happened to be working in a job where I could, have 3 days a week off, and I volunteered in the campaign and ended up helping to coordinate the volunteer side. And we did have a lot of fun. Thank God I'm elected.
Dan is understating what he did. If there is one person that made that election work, it is, well, two people, Dan Steppe and Carolyn Niemeyer. They really went out and found the people. And it was, if you can get somebody to give you $1, chances are they're going to go vote. And we knew we weren't going to do it with big money. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite stories about the Bud Clark campaign was the same night that Bud told us that he was going to run for mayor, and I whinily decided I would be the campaign manager. My husband's partner, Bob McCracken, said to Bud, well, Bud, if you're going to run for mayor, you have to have a suit. You have to get out and buy a suit. If you'll go buy a suit, I'll give you $1,000. And Bud said, really? And Bob said, sure, I'll give you $1,000. Bud stuck his hand out, Bob shook it. Well, Bud, in fact, went out and bought his suit, told Bob McCracken he had done so, and Bob wrote him a check on Patrick Lumber. My husband and Bob were in Patrick Lumber, on a Patrick Lumber check. And I want you all to know that that is the only corporate donor in the Bud Clark campaign in 1989.
Jimmy Dell, a customer of mine, is an Englishman, and he's passed away too, but he was a clothing salesman at Pufferstein's, I think it was, or something like that. I went down and he gave
He was
me...
at Rosenblatt's.
What?
Rosenblatt's. Rosenblatt's.
Okay. That's a company that's not here anymore. Anyway, with the suit on me, a double-breasted suit, looked very nice, and a week later I saw Goldschmidt, and he had the same suit on, and he'd been there, so I never been Before that, I only had a liquor commission suit.
There's one other thing that I want to point out, that this guy standing up here, if he tells you the sun is not going to come up tomorrow, go to the candle store. Because he's the guy that told us a lot of the strategy to make this thing work properly.
I'd like to read an editorial that was in the Oregonian in January of that year, and this was the feeling of a lot of readers of the Oregonian. It says, to the editor of the Oregonian, January 1st, the Oregonian seems determined to create a fervor of competition in next year's city election, despite the fact that there is little. Bud Clark, well-meaning platform to make Portland a friendliest city, has little chance against Frank Ivancie, his well-financed machine. And Portland voters will not likely trade in competent and experienced city members Mike Lindbergh and Carl Passantini, who has little to recommend him aside from available campaign funds. I suggest you stick to chasing fire trucks when you absolutely have a fire. That's what their feelings about Bud being there. Is she here tonight? Her name is Diane Gross.
What's the question? I'm sorry.
No, I don't have a question. I thought maybe you wanted to add something.
No.
All right, well, as a moderator, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and make a couple of points on this thing as well. And then maybe that'll generate a little more observation. Dan was very gracious in commenting on the strategy, and I will agree that I think we had a good strategy, and to the degree I was involved, I'll take a little bit of the credit. But I want to loop back to what everybody else has said, which is, and make a couple of points. One is, Bud Clark, on a person-to-person basis, I've been in this game for 40 years. I've worked with hundreds of candidates. He is one of the best one-on-one politicians I've ever seen.
Not a politician.
All right. He's one of the best one-on-one candidates I've ever seen. How's that? Feel better? Okay. Secondly, is what these folks said about the volunteers. When I joked that I didn't know anyone who was in the campaign, I know that you all know I didn't mean that in a bad way. What I meant was I didn't know any of you. But what I shortly found out was that this guy had, through the efforts of all of these folks, not tens, not dozens, but hundreds of people willing to pitch in and do something to help him. Now, some I'm sure did more and some less, but the broader point was the opposition had nothing to that effect. A third point I would also make is that we were, frankly, and to be candid, and I don't think anyone would disagree, actually aided by our opposition in this race because he had a certain arrogance and a belief that there was no way he could lose the race, and therefore he didn't have to campaign. When he did campaign, which was almost never, one of the favorite things he did was, and one or two of you might remember this, his TV ad basically was him in a helicopter above the city of Portland, which reinforced everything we were trying to say about Frank Ivancie, which is he's out of touch with Portland. So thank you very much for that. And we even made a radio ad pointing that out and urging folks to look at the ad because it simply reinforced his distance from the voters. But there are a myriad of reasons why this came out the way it did. But if I had to pick the number one, there's no question it was the people power. And I will give, again, we were very fortunate. Sometimes in campaigns you get a disproportionate share of breaks. I've been in a few of those. Sometimes you don't get any breaks at all. I've been in a few of those. But the fundamental thing that drove this campaign and this victory were the people who really, really, really worked very hard to get Bud elected. And I think that's, Tom made that observation, or Mike made that observation when we were backstage, and I think that's very, very true.
You pointed out something that we had a lot of negatives. Frank had a lot of negatives. There were certain things about things that were in the cop files and so forth, and I could have used those. Some people wanted me to use those negatives and put him down, but I would not even use Frank's name. But I would just say my opponent. When I was making speeches, I talk about my opponent. I used none of the negatives, and I can't understand why people use negatives so much now. They advertise their opponent as much as they do anything else. But anyway, I did Frank a great favor by beating him, because after that his wife was able to get a divorce, which he'd wanted for years. He was appointed by the Reagan administration to be the Maritime Commission. He got a $20,000 a year raise by that. And then after the divorce, he married some countess that he met in New York City, and I think they live in California now.
Well, looking back to the...
Hold on. In a word, I just want to say it was a win-win for everybody. We got him out of town, and Frank upgraded.
Looking back at the timeline that we created, you did complain about Ivancie one time, I recall. You accused him of using city stationery to announce he's running. Do you recall that?
I don't recall that, but that's a big negative, isn't it?
Well, not only that, he had a driver take him in his car to lunch that same day, so what's the difference?
What's that?
He had a driver. Frank always had a driver.
Oh, no, he had, Garvey, Sergeant Garvey drove him. Well, anyway, that's after the campaign was over, and that was part of the administration. I didn't need a driver. Yeah, I rode my bicycle. But it was a fun campaign. We had a great time. Yeah, we really did.
There was another interesting...
And there's all kinds of things that I didn't even know were going on, because everybody kind of went out and started doing their job, and we go in a certain direction, and it all came together, and I'm still finding out things that I didn't know that happened in the campaign.
There's another interesting thing on the timeline that mentions Ivancie is you had bought a $100 dinner to go to dinner with Ivancie. You couldn't get him to go to dinner, so you sold it for $35. Do you recall that?
No, I don't. Cadro said we needed to have, we had to need to do something in the media. The only media thing we did was billboards, and it was a picture of me shaking hands. I can't remember what it said on the billboard, but anyway, that was the only media exposure we have, and I don't know if you can call that media in a sense, but it was, well, it was advertising. Well, it was going to cost $35,000, and so I went out and borrowed $50,000 on my house to pay the $35,000 and some other costs, but almost everything was volunteers. It was people donating their time and energy, and obviously they had to spend some money in doing that. So it was completely a people's campaign, and it put Portland back on the map too.
I don't ever like to contradict a mayor, even an ex-mayor. But we did run radio the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, you're totally
yeah.
See, that's something I discovered or I'd forgotten about too, was this radio ad. Yeah.
And one other point I would make is Bud was absolutely correct. Bud stayed completely positive and upbeat personally. However, the radio ads did throw an elbow or two. We'll just leave it at that.
And the rest of us were often in tears. Bud was positive and upbeat, but it wasn't always that easy to be positive and upbeat. You know, it was a hard scrabble campaign. We all make it sound like it was all fun, but it wasn't all fun. It was a lot of hard work. And Dan and Carol and Bud, I mean, I don't know how many candidates fairs we went to. Lots of candidates fairs. Ivancie didn't appear at any of them. So at that point, there would be 7 or 8 candidates, and everyone would, I mean, anybody who had $50 could file for mayor. And they would show up and at the candidates fair in order to make their little speech about whatever it was that was their particular shtick. And at the end, Bud would give his little speech about, you people can take your city back. You can own Portland. Portland can belong to the citizens. And, you know, it is just over and over and over and over, and we stayed with the same thing. But it wasn't all laughter and it wasn't all fun. A lot of it was hard work.
Well, and it was a strategy that Tim and Mike put together as well. That, you know, I remember very distinctly Mike Carstensen saying, look, this is January. The election is in May. We've got X number of days. We've got Y number of voters. That means we've got to make Z number of contacts every day. And that's what Carolyn and I and all the other volunteers in the campaign were out doing, is making those contacts that Bud would not be physically capable of getting to all of those people one-on-one. So that's where the volunteer side really paid off, I think.
During that whole time, he was going to poster signings too, because we were selling the Expose Yourself to Art poster for $25 a piece for signatures, and he was using that for campaign money.
Bud never stopped. He was first thing in the morning, last thing at night, he was campaigning every day. But one of the things I think that made it work exceptionally well is that we enabled the volunteers who said, I want to do something. Instead of saying, oh no, you can't do that, we would all generally say, that's a great idea. Go for it, we'll help you if we can. And people became, it became part of them. The enthusiasm was theirs as opposed to other types of campaigns, I think.
Carolyn, what are the names of the couple, semi-elderly couple? I don't want to call anybody elderly anymore, but anyways, a couple went around to the taverns, and we had these jars with Bud Clark is Serious buttons in the jar, and at the taverns, and they put $1 in for or whatever they wanted to in the jar to be aware of the campaign. And they'd go to all the taverns all over the city and pick up the dollars and put more buttons in and so forth. And then I'd go out like on Lombard and so forth, and go to the taverns on Saturdays and talk to people. And then also I had a canoe trailer behind my bicycle, and I put a big sign, a banner that said Bud Clark for mayor, and we put lawn signs and stuff. And a friend of mine rode the bicycle, and we go down at the end of Foster, out to 82nd and Foster, and then come back into town and out Sandy Boulevard. And I'd knock on all the business doors there, and then they would take signs and so forth. And it was people to people, and we've never seen a politician out here before. What's your name? You know. Anyway, it brought attention, and it exposed the campaign to all different branches of this town. I've lived in many, many parts of the town, so I know the town pretty well, and I know it even better now, but I still discover how well the neighborhoods are doing now and how wonderful the city feels overall. So thank you, Carolyn, for finding those two people to take care of the jars, too.
I suspect they found us and we said, go for it.
Part of the magic, I think, was the talent beyond just the boots on the ground. I mean, these buttons and the posters for Sunday afternoon tavern events. I mean, the art that went into that was extraordinary. I don't think I've ever seen a campaign that had the quality of the artwork that this one had. And it was all volunteer stuff. Guys were coming in and doing really terrific stuff with that was capturing imagination and attention, like the white dinner jacket and the red rose. That was the signature of the campaign. All of that came together, I think, extremely well.
I think at the time we were trying to make a lot of things different than what we've seen in the run-of-the-mill politician. In fact, when the first campaign button we came out with was Bud Clark for mayor. Now, that's pretty boring. So when people would look at the button, they would say, "Is this guy serious?" And we had heard that over and over and over again. And finally, we settled in on we need to have a button that says he's serious. And so that's how they came about with the Bud Clark is serious. In fact, in February, we ran our first Bud Clark is serious ad. That was the first newsprint ad that we had done on February 7th. And there wasn't much newspaper advertising until the last day, on the 14th, when we had a half page. So really, there wasn't much newspaper at all.
That was Mike's idea. The whole idea was, well, anyway, I got the button, and Carolyn signed me up to go down, and Dr. Joyce Brothers was in town, and she was down at the Benson Hotel and was going to make a speech to some women, and Carolyn sent me down there to introduce myself and talk to different people, and I had this brand new button on, Bud Clark is serious. And Dr. Joyce Brothers is really short, and she looked up at me and she said, "What does that mean?" That was exactly the response we wanted, because it created that conversation, and I could say, well, I'm running for mayor, and so forth and so on, and what do you think is wrong with the city? What needs to be done in this city? So anyway, thank you, Mike, for getting that idea, and thank you for sending me down to Dr. Joyce Brothers.
So the moderator will interject here again for a minute and kind of take you through. We've sort of set the stage of the kinds of things that the campaign did, the efforts that were put forward. And we talked at the beginning with basically 9 weeks to go, Frank Ivancie had a 30-point lead. In the middle of April, Portland General Electric, Bud had a friend at Portland General Electric, Doug Hyder, who PGE had done a poll on the mayor's race, and that poll basically showed, and he passed this on to Bud, who gave it to us, that basically showed Ivancie's lead had been cut in half in a month, from 30 points to 15 points. We couldn't talk about this because I think Hyder wasn't really supposed to give it to Bud, and in fact, I'm pretty convinced that he probably, PGE probably did the poll to help Mayor Ivancie, but due to Bud's relationship with Mr. Hyder, it wound up in our hands. So that fired our enthusiasm a little bit more, and realized we are on target, we're closing the gap, we're uniting the anti-Ivancie vote. We had a chance to go out right at the beginning of May, so now we're 2 weeks out with a final short poll. We were also working for Commissioner Mike Lindbergh at the time, who was facing a difficult challenge from, I believe, Carl Passantini. So we were able to look at both races at that time, and son of a gun, that poll came out and showed Bud had chopped the lead down to 11 points. We were still gaining. In the last weekend before on the Friday before the Tuesday vote, remember we didn't have vote by mail in those days, so it was almost everybody went to the ballot box and voted except for absentees. The Oregonian did a poll which showed the race was a dead heat. They didn't believe the poll. They told the pollster to go back out and poll again. And he came back with another poll and he said it's effectively tied. At that point, I remember hearing that news and thinking, oh, I'll be darned, maybe we are going to pull this off. Again, any of you who know me know I'm a bit of a pessimist when it comes to working campaigns. It's a good way to be. But what that also provoked was what we were hoping would happen from the other side, which in essence, the mayor, the incumbent, had ignored our campaign completely, dismissed us, and was disrespectful. And then when he found out 72 or 96 hours before the election we were going to vote that he was in a hell of a lot of trouble, he then basically went hard negative in a very, very ugly way. That blew up in his face. And I think we would have won anyway, but to my mind there's no doubt that I believe what other folks called the sewer stuff that Mr. Ivancie did wound up probably adding 2 or 3 points to our margin. But so after ignoring us for 3 months, or 4 months, or 5 months, he decided in the last 72 hours he would go very harshly negative, and it blew up in his face. And that helped us a lot. So that's where we got to where we got to. And I believe the final vote, I think, was 54 to, I think...
54.6.
But it is counted.
Yeah, I'm sure. That's one figure I've always remembered. And the thing was, too, that negative, I think Frank didn't even realize that he was in trouble. I mean, really, Tom McDonald told me this, it was at the St. John's Parade. The St. John's Parade was on the 12th of May that year, and the election was on Tuesday the 15th. In that parade on Saturday the 12th, Frank was in the front of the parade, and people were booing him. And I was in the back of the parade on this Second World War duck, they call it, an amphibious truck, actually. And I was wearing a white dinner coat like this with a rose, and that's the reason I wore it today. And they were cheering me. And then when they had a meeting afterwards, Tom McDonald said that he really was concerned that something was going wrong, and that negative advertising then started up. And he only had a couple of days to do it. But I felt confident that being in that parade, the feeling in that parade that we're going to win. Those calls on those taverns and being out in the neighborhood had paid off.
I'm surprised he didn't do it in a helicopter.
I don't remember what the story was
We should bring out.
week.
Go ahead, man.
But on a couple of days before the election, there was a positive story about Bud, and I remember that the Ivancie camp was out taking papers out of the boxes. That's how desperate they were
I have one more anecdotal story, but I think a valuable one to add to Bud's, not as important. But on the Saturday before the election, you may remember the Oregonian used to publish a Sunday, and still does publish a Sunday paper, I think, early on Saturday. And that had the poll in it that showed that Bud was tied with Frank Ivancie. And I was in line in a convenience store in Northeast Portland, and back behind 4 or 5 people. And just to kind of see what kind of reaction I would get, I'm a pollster, I asked these questions, and I said, I noted the headline. I said, well, who the heck is Bud Clark? And somebody in the line chirped up and said, well, he's the guy who's going to beat Frank Ivancie's ass. And everybody else in the line nodded, and that's when the bulb finally went off for me. It wasn't a St. John's Parade, but that was probably the biggest aha moment for me of all. It was great fun.
The negative ads that Tim is making reference to was Jerry Pratt and Frank Ivancie put out a flyer, saying, would you vote for a godless man? I think it was. A godless man. And that came out about the same time as the parade. And it fired back on Frank, basically. The Oregonians said he lost several points over that, and they called it sleazy advertising. This, however, was an editorial after the campaign. But their editorial basically said this isn't a measurement of who's qualified to be a candidate by their religious beliefs. It should be a contest for their political beliefs. And the Oregonian hit it right on the head. But like Tim said, he probably lost 4 or 5 points with that move.
It didn't help, that's for sure. And those of you as well, and Jack McGowan I see out there might in particular remember, Channel 8 used to have had a political commentator, a public affairs commentator named Floyd McKay, who had watched the race, but I'll tell you for the first time that I was back channeling bits of information to Floyd during the course of the campaign.
See, you keep discovering things.
Telling him that, I'm not claiming anything, but this thing is going to be a lot more interesting than you might think. And on the last, after Ivancie did what he did, which was the harshly and ugly negative stuff he did, McKay did an editorial that literally ripped Mayor Ivancie a new one, saying that you could tell the character of a man by how he responded during a crisis, and Frank Ivancie has failed miserably. And make no mistake, that didn't help him. And this was the very last, either the Sunday or the Monday before the election. And in those days, people actually listened to television commentators, and I think it did not, let's just say I don't think it helped Frank either. So that's another piece of this negative stuff that he did that I think blew up on him.
Well, he was pushing the panic button.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think it's significant to remember that what really won this election was Bud Clark himself and his love for Portland. He still loves Portland. He's more fun than anyone to walk around Portland with because he can tell you history about something that happened on every block. It was an absolute privilege to work for Bud Clark.
Well, and there was
I
also,
always like Mike was Mike brought in all these wonderful people, Dan and Carolyn and brought in also Jan Van Domelen, who's now Mrs. McGowan, of course, married to Jack McGowan, and she's here in the audience. But there was this beautiful young lady that she brought in the campaign to drive me around, and I thought it was a test. I thought Mike was testing me. Was I going to try to solicit or make out or try to make out?
I'm cutting you off.
Anyway, I'm pretty straight.
the thing that I wanted to add is to Mike's comment was the absolute certainty on Bud's part that he was going to win. One of my treasures is a poster signed by Bud on March 14th of 1984 that said, "To Master Staffer Dan Steffi from the next mayor of Portland." And it's hanging on the wall in my office now. But that's just that certainty. We all knew that he was dead certain that he was going to win.
Yeah. You don't borrow $50,000 in your house if you're not serious. I mean, that was a lot more money. Probably be more than $100,000 now. So. Anyway.
I do want to echo something that Mike said.
Hey, Tim, use the mic a little bit closer.
You bet. I do want to echo very quickly something that Mike Karstensen said. Again, I've been in this game 4 decades. I've worked for literally hundreds of candidates. I don't think I've ever been prouder, and still to this day, prouder to work for a candidate like Bud.
Thank you. That's really we said we talked about debt here a bit, about a campaign debt and so forth. And there was a businessmen got together after I was elected and had a big dinner. I think it was the Hilton at the time, and raised some money, and that helped capitalize. What the best idea was the mayor's ball, and that was Bob McCracken and Billy Holtz and Phil Thompson, and they all claimed that they thought of the idea to begin with, but they worked as a team to make it happen. And we had the mayor's ball in January of 1985 that really polished off the debt. And we had 8 of them all at the time as an office, and none of it went towards campaigning after that, but all of it went to charity. And there was $300,000 or $400,000 that went to charities in those 8 years of mayor's balls, which was really a win-win situation for the city too at the time. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate those 3 people are all dead now, and I really miss them.
Tim, did we want to do questions? Was that the idea? Okay.
First of all, let's look at
All right, so next we're going to ask you to ask the questions. But first we have kind of a surprise that's really fun, and I want to bring up Jeff Gearing to tell you all about it.
Cool. Good evening, Bud, good evening, panelists, and good evening, audience. On behalf of the Portland Rose Festival Foundation, we join Portland in celebrating the legacy that Bud Clark has built for us over the last 30 years. As we've learned tonight, he is truly one of Portland's most colorful personalities and memorable leaders. Bud Clark's been a long supporter of the Portland Rose Festival, and that started with his mayorship and the friendship he stemmed with us from that office. In fact, in 2007, Bud dressed up as Rex Oregonius and led our centennial celebration through the streets of Portland back in 2007. Now tonight, Tonight we celebrate Bud and the leadership of our community, and with the support of the Portland Rose Festival, I'd like to announce that on Saturday, May 31st, Bud Clark will lead our PGE Solve Starlight Parade as the 2014 Grand Marshal.
Thank you very much. This is somewhat of a surprise, and it just happened in the last day that I knew this was going to happen, but I thought my parades were all through. So this is the last parade, and it'll be a joyous time on the 31st, and we'll just see what happens, and it'll be a great time, and we'll talk about it later. And anyway, I've always, that's another story in a way, that I always wore a rose. I always wore a flower. When I was a kid, the best known mayor of the United States was the mayor of New York City. It was Fiorello LaGuardia, who they called a little flower. And he always wore a flower at his lapel. So when I first started running for mayor, I said, I'm going to wear a flower at my lapel. And of course it's going to be a rose, because this is the city of roses. And we have a great rose festival every year that identifies the city and brings people from all over the world. And those Rosarians and so forth are the ambassadors that would greet the delegates coming from out of town, and it's just a wonderful organization that benefits all of us in the city of Portland and brings us all together every June. And it's a long process. You start, I forget when they first start selecting the high school students to be queens and kings and so forth. And so, anyway, thank you very much. Whoop, whoop, for the festival.
All right, I invite anyone and everyone to come up and ask questions. We'd like you to come to the microphone so everyone can hear the questions. I'll start off with one. You talked about on Frank Ivancie's flyer that he deemed you the, what did he call it, the godless man?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell the story of how he came up with that?
The first interview I had for a paper, I think it was on Noma, a monthly newspaper or something. A woman came to my house, and we got through with all the interview, and I have a statue in my backyard at that time. I still have a statue, of course, of two crows flying. And I started making comments about this, or she asked about the two crows that were flying, a beautiful metal statue by Tom Hardy, and that I had commissioned. And it was because that I was interested in crows, and I said I want to be reincarnated. If I want to be reincarnated in the next life, I've been such a good guy in this life. I want to be reincarnated a crow and sit up in the tree and complain all the time, caw, 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 caw. And my wife Sigrid said that she would like, could she be Mrs. Crow? I said, of course. And so that's the reason I got the statue done and so forth. And then later I was reading about the trilogy of the gods of the Vikings, and Odin was the main god of the trilogy of the Vikings, and Odin had two crows, Hugin and Mudin. Thought and memory means thought and memory, and they would fly all over the world every night, and then they'd come back and land on Odin's shoulder and tell him what was going on all over the world. And I said, because I wanted to be a crow and so forth, and because of Odin, I must be a born-again pagan. Well, that was the headline in the newspaper. That's how I got this godless trait somehow. Anyway. Okay, thank you very much for asking that question.
Growing up in Portland in the 80s, one of the things, as a small child, that of course I remember is the expose yourself to art posters that were all over the place. And growing up, I had always thought that this was something that you did as mayor, as part of some big Portland city art campaign. And so I was really surprised to hear you guys say that it was something that was part of the original campaign, the original campaign fundraising. So I was just curious as to how then did the Expose Yourself to Art campaign start, and how did that become kind of part of the campaign?
Well, that was an interesting story. It didn't start out to be a poster at all. I was part of the neighborhood association, the Northwest District Association, and they assigned me to the Venereal Disease Action Council. And this was VDAC, and they had meetings downtown on early morning, one of the weekday mornings, and it was a lot of doctors were there and so forth. And this is because gonorrhea was going through the high schools at that time. It was before AIDS. People didn't know about AIDS. This was like 1977 in that period. And so they wanted to raise the consciousness of this to the high school kids. See, the birth control pill changed, all the sexual habits of people. And so they had this T-shirt that they wanted to sell. They wanted to sell it to high school kids, and it said, "Zap the clap." And on the back, it had this telephone number called the Venereal Disease Action Council. Well, one of the ideas, Derek Mearden had this idea of going down, and I told him that I was riding a bicycle then, and I wore a poncho and so forth. And that's back when people still wore suits downtown, and women wore hats and umbrellas, and I was walking by this statue, and then the suggestion came from Derek Bearden that I flash the statue. Well, I didn't even know what flashing was, but one morning, Mike Ryerson and I got together, and we went down to the statue when it was down on 5th and Washington, and he took several pictures of me exposing myself with this wonderful coat to this statue. And there was this one picture that you can't see the T-shirt or anything, but it's so funny just looking at it, that we had a contest. The neighbor newspaper was brand new then in 1978, and we had a contest in the paper with $25, Mike? Was the prize?
Prize if you named the poster.
Yeah, if you put a caption on this picture. And there was like 350 entries, which was amazing to me.
Some of them better than the one that came out.
What's that?
Want to buy a watch was pretty funny.
Yeah, want to buy a watch. You got a transfer, there's all kinds. Anyway, then I think 3 people won the prize, right?
Yeah,
and
they had
split
to
the
share
$25.
Susie Conklin was one of
$25.
them.
Yeah, and then Mike said, I think that might make a good poster. And I said, go for it. And so he was trying to get the money, the first $500 to make it a poster. And I don't know, you finally had to borrow it from somebody, right?
I did. I borrowed it from a gal. She gave me $500. Well, first I went to the neighborhood association, and I said, here's my idea. I want to do a poster, and I'll split anything I make on it. Well, they would have made a lot of money if they split it. Chuck Duffy's here in the audience. He'll tell you that story. And so they refused, so I borrowed from $500 from one of the gals that was on the board, and I went to Neighbor Fair with 800 posters and sold out. Yeah. So then we were on a roll after that. And it was so
and he
far
couldn't stop selling.
The image is probably sold well over.
We have a young man with a question here.
Okay. It sold 250,000 copies before I ran for mayor.
As an elderly man, son, I've earned this age. For me, and so did this good mayor over here. The main question I have, that was 30 years ago, and now we are 30 years later with big money in campaigns, a lot of media attention, a lot of people turned off to politics. What would you say to the people running today that you would do differently today, and what would you do the same? And what can you say to give people a little more hope that politics matters?
That's a tough one. I don't have the answers really, but I just wish people paid more attention, and could get through all the baloney that's out there. There's so many ridiculous statements that people come up with and lies, and maybe people getting together and talking about these things. I think there ought to be more discussion about politics. Right now, most people, you don't even want to talk about it because it's so repulsive, and it's all cliches. There's no thought given by it. You don't have, the newspapers aren't focused to condense things. Everything is such short statements. And I wish I knew the answer. As getting old, I tend to be pretty pessimistic.
Let me give you a suggestion on how somebody might run for office. I tried this on my wife when she ran successfully for county commissioner. She turned me down. But here's a suggestion. Don't vote for me. Don't vote for me because I will always tell you the truth. And you don't want to know the truth.
You got any suggestions?
Well, as Admiral Stockdale said in that debate many years ago, I'm out of ammo on that one.
May I point out that he outsold Farrah Fawcett?
As well he should have. Yes, sir.
Okay, so when I was young, the Portland police were considered pretty brutal. And I remember when we used to go down to Chiricahua and stuff there, they'd always be out there.
Are you a cop?
No, sir. And, but so when you were running for mayor, the idea that you were going to clean up the Portland police was pretty much a joke to everybody. But you did implement community policing. So I'm curious, what was the pushback? What was the response? And how did you get the Portland police to take you seriously as mayor and putting new policies in place with the police?
I'm not sure that they still have, actually. But, no, it's a very difficult thing, and Mike Reese is a great guy as a chief. I wish he was around when, I wish I could have appointed a chief, but the situation, the community policing, actually, I was mayor-elect, and a guy, Rader, anyway, he was, I can't remember his name, maybe I'll think of it in a minute, but he had done a comparison of police departments for the Eisenhower Foundation, comparing 3 police departments: the Portland Police Department, the Tokyo Police Department, and the Santa Ana Police Department. And the idea that was a comparison with the Portland was the traditional way of doing things. You know, you just wait for somebody, even if you can see they're going to do it, you just wait until they do it, and then you arrest them and take them through the courts. The Tokyo Police Department was the police officers living in the neighborhood. They knew the neighborhood. They knew everybody in the neighborhood, and they talked to them on the street and so forth. The Santa Ana, and they were all, of course, they were all the same. There wasn't a big diversity of because they're all Japanese or Japanese. But and the Santa Ana Police Department, where the cops were getting, they were trying to hire with diversity of representing the population that was in the city because of the Hispanics and so forth. It wasn't just a straight white police force, and they were getting out of their cars. That was a big complaint here in Portland, that the cops didn't get out of their cars, they didn't communicate. And so this idea of community policing came from that video that he came and showed to us when I was mayor-elect. And the first thing I did, of course, was to fire Chief Still, and I fired Davis later, and both of them ran against me in the second campaign, but I won anyway.
That was actually part of our strategy. We wanted to have about 10 or 12 ex-police chiefs in there.
Well, anyway,
but that's another.
They've made a lot of progress since then, and I just read Moose's book, and he was trying and really tried to change a lot in the system too, which was good. Tom Potter was the same way.
As Chuck Duffy will attest, that became known as the chief du jour strategy for retreading the Portland Police Bureau.
Yeah, I was 12 in '84. I do remember TV ads in the end, one with you talking to Dr. Lyndon Smith, who was a local...
Dr. what?
Lyndon Smith, I believe his name was. Do any of you remember those TV ads?
That was probably in the second campaign.
Oh,
That had to be the second campaign, because I didn't do any... We spent a lot of money I didn't like spending money in the second campaign. I always said, for the... You're buying TV in this market, you're buying it for the whole state of Oregon and not just the 500,000 people that live in the city of Portland. So I always thought it was too expensive with what you got, and it's a lot better having people going door to door and campaigning that way as best you can. Of course, now it's a whole different world because you've got the internet and email and social networking and so forth. I'd like to get something clear. I've had a lot of people say that at the Fat City Cafe, that's where I fired Chief Davis, and a lot of people think that I was the one that said "read my lips," but actually it was we had these files that the auditor had done, and had some suggestions for the police department to change the way the patrols were run to save a lot of money, and they were computer files then that you couldn't transfer electronically, and they had all the files at the auditor's office, and it would take a lot of money to move all this paper over to the Justice Center. Well, Chief Davis was demanding that those papers be transferred over to there, and I told him earlier that wasn't going to happen. But on this breakfast morning, I met with him once a week, He said, "Mr. Mayor, read my lips. I want those papers moved over to my office from the auditor's office." And I said, "Read my lips. You're no longer the chief of police." So that's good.
Since you've mentioned that, Bud, tell us, did you go to Fat City with that in mind, or is it something that just came up while you were having breakfast with him? Were you going to get rid of him?
No. There was no intention of getting rid of him at that time. No, I thought, he was doing it. I was, we'd had a change, of course, and Penny Harrington, on the one hand, she always had her ideas of what, she would consult with her chiefs about or her deputy chiefs about what was going to happen or what needed to be taken care of the next day. And then they'd come back the next morning and she's doing something entirely differently. And Dave was the other way around. His deputies told him what to do. Anyway, I had no intention of firing him that morning. It was the fact that he told me he was demanding that the mayor, he didn't realize I was in charge, and that was what I thought was wrong with the department to begin with, is that the mayor is in charge of the police department, is the only one in the department. He's the one that appoints the chief, and he's the only one that can fire the chief. And Charles Jordan came to me after I was elected. He was the only one of the commission. Well, I was good friends with most of them anyway. But Charles Jordan came to me after the election. He said, "You should always assign the police department to one of the commissioners because it gives you so many problems, And I said, "Well, that's probably what the problem is. If you can't fire the chief, and then so that's the reason I took it over. And I think every mayor since then has kept the chief, has been under the police department's been under the mayor, and I think it makes a better. It's a better idea."
Did you both finish your breakfast that morning?
What's that?
Did you finish your breakfast?
I don't think so.
I just have to say, I'm beginning to feel like Bud is Ryerson's straight man here. It's all the good lines, Mike.
It's true that if Bud gives you an assignment, you take it seriously. He asked me to do something about homelessness early in 1985. And so I kind of did a little bit of research and discovered that this had been around for 150 years or whatever, and maybe I could take a little bit of time to figure out what to do with it. Along about July, something like that, we were at a meeting of the Old Town Chinatown Business Association, and they were saying, "You got to do something about this problem. People are messing up our doorways, and it's just a problem." And Bud turned around and he said, "I told you to fix that." And listen, this guy, he pointed to me, this guy is going to fix it. So you hold him accountable.
And he did fix it.
By January, I think, we had a city and county resolution adopted to approve the mayor's 12-point plan for the homeless. But Bud was serious. He is serious.
And Dan did the 12-point plan, and so that building downtown ought to be called the Dan Steffi building, not the Bud Clark building. Anyway, it's a horrible problem, and I think this is obviously a national problem, and almost an international problem, that there has to be a better way of distributing the wealth of the nation and the world, because there's too much difference.
Well, Bud, how are you?
Hey, I remember this guy.
Yes, I spent 5 years covering Bud at City Hall, and he certainly kept us busy firing as chiefs of police. And I do remember the morning at the Fat City Cafe. But I wanted to ask one question, make one comment. Before we all forget, Bud Clark was involved at the time he was elected in getting the convention center passed and the regional ballots, so that's one other part of his legacy we should not forget. Tim, I had a question primarily for you, but also for Bud. There's a lot of talk when you talk about the campaign of the media not paying much attention until that poll came out in the Oregonian. You mentioned early in your presentation that much of the response you were getting was against Frank Ivancie rather than for Bud Clark, although he campaigned and showed himself to voters. So was this primarily a vote for Bud or against Ivancie, and would more media coverage more legitimate coverage by the media of this event helped him or hurt him?
Those are good questions. I think what I would say at the beginning was probably in the middle of April, it was mostly an I once tested my cat against Frank Ivancie, and this is a true story, and the cat grew 14%. So I think at the beginning, it was mostly an anti-Ivancie vote, but I would say by the end, most of that vote was a pro-Bud Clark vote. People like Bud. Again, I wasn't being flippant or unserious when I said, you called yourself a politician, by the way. I heard you say it earlier, so I'm going to use it again. I've seen very few folks who've run for public office with the one-on-one abilities Bud had. Others here said he basically busted his behind from dawn to dusk, and I think people liked him. So I think by the end of the campaign, it was mostly a pro-Clark vote. I think many of those folks were delighted to vote against Frank Ivancie, but they were also casting, at that point, a positive vote, saying, gosh, I really like this guy. It's not just, putting a finger in Frank's eye. I'm voting for somebody I feel good about. Now, is the question of more media would have helped or hurt? You raise an interesting question there. And I don't have a solid answer to it. I will say we tried to run kind of a stealth campaign, which was not to wake Frank up until it was too late. And then when he did wake up, he would do something stupid, which he did, or his people did, which was to panic. So I don't know if more press would have helped or hurt. There might be differing opinions about it, this up here. In my view, I was delighted with the amount of press we got. Because I think it actually furthered the broader goal, which was to fly under the radar and gain on Ivancie until it was too late for him to really do anything about it, except to go hard negative, again, which blew up on him. So personally, I wasn't unhappy with that.
I think there's a certain percentage of the vote that was, we got to give Frank a lesson. I know Ned Look was trying to get his friends to vote. We just got to teach him a lesson. There was one fellow that lived close to him that told me that he voted for him because he was mad at Frank for going through this stop sign all the time. But we probably intended to, they had no idea that I'd win in the primary, and that's what the difference was. So
I'm doing it, and on the radio ad we did, which went after Frank for speaking to the people of Portland for a helicopter, but not campaigning, we drove that message. Send Frank Ivancie a message in the primary. People will often use primaries as a protest vote or a protest vehicle. But again, I want to reiterate, there's no question that by the end of that campaign, a lot of folks who hadn't known Bud at the beginning had developed a pretty strong affection for him politically, from the way in which he campaigned and the way in which he presented himself to Portlanders. So in my view, it was, while it may have been a surprise, and some voters might definitely have been wanting to give Frank a yank on the nose, I think at the end of the day, most of those folks are saying, yeah, I want to give Frank a yank on the nose, but I really like this guy too.
It should be noted too that it wasn't just Bud and Frank. There were 6 other. There was a total of 7 candidates. So it wasn't just a one-on-one race.
I think, Tim, that the thing you're talking about, people like Bud, was reflected on election night. That election night party was something out of a movie. I mean, it was unreal, the amount of people that congregated. It was also reflected in the first mayor's ball. That was election night on steroids. It was really amazing, the number of people that showed up, and the positive energy and all of that, both on election night and on the first mayor's ball and subsequent ones.
Hi, Darrell Johnson. Former curator for the Rose Test Gardens, known as Hank down at the coast. I just wanted to mention that I had some doings with your opponent before you ran, and there was a program where your opponent was trying to make some publicity over a grant that we were getting federal money for, and I remember that they set up this project that I set up, and the first thing that Frank does is the first day that we're doing this project in the garden, he comes up and gets his publicity through the media, and I never heard back from him again. And then I remember it was a traditional thing for the Rose Society to have a luncheon every year during Rose Festival time. And I remember that Frank came to that particular luncheon, and of course he didn't know anything about the Rose Society, didn't know much about the Rose Garden either. But I informed him about various things that we did at the luncheon and what was going on in the city when it came to the roses and so on and so forth. And so when I introduced him, he came up and made a rather nice presentation on all the information I'd given him, but obviously he didn't give me any credit for it. and I must say, over the time that I've gotten to know Bud, it was an entirely different feeling when Bud came to the luncheons. When you would meet Bud on the street, you knew that you were talking to a person that wanted to hear your side of the story, who was always friendly, who was always hospitable, and was a very good listener. So I appreciate that part. And the other thing, of course, running the Rose Garden, I thought it was quite remarkable that we had our leader always wearing a rosebud. And one of my favorite ones that you would wear was Double Delight, and that's what we got out of you. Thank you.
You know, we were in a big recession at that time. In Portland and Oregon, the whole state was in trouble because we didn't have the electronics industry to the extent that we do now, and the diversity of industry. But we were, you know, Reagan was spending all the money on the military, and so Washington and every place that had military bases and a lot of military manufacturing were doing well. The East Coast, Massachusetts, and so forth, and California and Washington. But here, we were dependent on agriculture and on lumber, and the dollar was high, and the interest rates were high, so people weren't building houses nationwide, and we couldn't sell wheat overseas because our dollar was so high, it was costing too much money. And I'd always had a lot of architects that came into the Goose Hollow Inn, and in previous recessions, they always had something on the boards that were going to be built in the future, you know, something, there were drawings. But this recession, they were having to go out of town to do any business at all. And I had a son, Jason was in college, and two other kids in high school and so forth, Rachel and Nick. And the city was in trouble, and it was like the mayor wasn't doing anything to do this. And so the object of this election was to get Portland back on a map and feeling good about itself. And that's where the campaign, it was just a week after I was elected that Pat LaCrosse came to me with a list of things that had been proposed for the city. And on the second, it was a page and a half of double-spaced projects. On the second page was build a convention center. And I said, well, Seattle's had a convention center for 25 years. We've never had one. We just have the Coliseum. We're going to build a convention center. So that was the beginning of getting a more positive attitude. We got it passed in the metro area, and it had a lot of other spin-offs. And I think now they're going to get a hotel to go with it, which will really bolster the use of it. But anyway, the idea was to get Portland back on the map. There was still a residual. It wasn't meant the way it was that Tom McCall had said, come visit and don't stay. But that was still a stigma that was on the city, and thinking that we didn't want to do business in the city. But we needed the economy, and we're certainly doing well now, I think.
So speaking of revitalization, I want you to share the story of this place and why we can be here tonight, thanks to you and Dan.
Yeah, that's a good story.
Where's Melissa? Stand up, Melissa. There you go. There is the story. Melissa lives across the street, okay? And she came into our office and said, you're going to do something to save this building. This is an architectural gem. It has to be preserved. And the school district doesn't want to preserve it. They're letting it deteriorate. And the suspicion in the neighborhood is that they want to let it get so deteriorated that we'll tear it down. And then they'll have all that wonderful dirt to do something significant. But it asked me to be involved in creating neighborhood revitalization strategy for Northeast Portland. If you recall, in the mid-late 80s, this was a very depressed area with a lot of drug dealing and that sort of thing. And Marie and I were living, this goes on for a while.
I'm going to cut you off.
We were living in Northwest Portland, and somehow coming to Northeast Portland and telling people how to organize their community felt a little incongruous. And she, God bless her, agreed to move with me to 9th and Northeast Wygant, dead center of Crack Alley. And so in this process of creating this strategy, we've convened city, county, state officials to think about what we could do. And Melissa's appearance in our office fit into that. What are we going to do? In some way, we didn't know. But short and a long story, part of that, Joe Overall, an attorney, was on the school board and said, well, maybe we could figure out what to do with some of this surplus property. And so I began discussions with Don McElroy, who was Prophet's business manager at the school district. And 4 years later, we managed to hit an agreement to buy this property from the school district by giving them the proceeds from the payments in lieu of taxes from the housing authority. It was the most convoluted deal you can imagine. But we got the property under city control. I left the city, and the McMenamins came along and responded to a proposal and saved this gorgeous thing. Thank you, Melissa.
Another story about changing the neighborhood. I talked to Carolyn Niemeyer. We had a situation on Mississippi Avenue. We had drug dealers on Mississippi and Shaver. We had a shooting out there, and there was only one business open. It was the New Value grocery store, which is still there with bars in the windows. And I told the head of narcotics at that time, I said, we got to do something about the drug dealers in Mississippi and Shaver. And the head of narcotics at that time said, Mr. Mayor, those drug dealers have been there for 25 years. We can't do anything about that. I said, what the fuck? We got a police department for? And anyway, you got to start from the bottom up. The cops on the street wanted to do something, but the mid-management didn't. So Carolyn got together with the cops on the street. She got the neighborhood organized to form patrols and would call the cops on the street when there was when they saw the drug dealers out there. Got the building department to condemn a building and a whole variety of things. And you know all the details. But anyway, Carol Niemeyer cleaned up Mississippi Avenue and it's doing all right today.
Hi, I'm a newbie. I only came here in 1990, but you were probably the first mayor that I was aware of. And just not very long ago, I was trolling the internet, as I often do, looking for information about things. And somehow I ended up looking at pictures and posters. And of all the posters I saw, there was exposing yourself to art. And I know there's been a question asked about it already, but my question is that still for sale? Where do the profits go? What's going on with that now? Because I was astonished.
Yeah, Mike Beard's in the audience here someplace. He's got them for sale, I think. And you can get them in almost every framing shop, I'm sure, around town and so forth. And no, it's still for sale, and I don't know how many hundreds of thousands it's sold by now, but it sold $250,000 before I ran for mayor. So.
And when you get the poster, you'll sign it for $50 and give the money to the clerks.
Boy, the price has gone up. I didn't know. I didn't have much money.
With your comments about giving some of the campaign funds to charities, I wondered whether that poster was still generating perhaps a charitable contribution, or who has ownership of it, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, Mike doesn't have ownership of it, but it's Mike Beard.
No, I sold the rights to the poster about 20 years ago, in fact.
Yeah.
But we did use the poster to get rid of the debt.
Yeah, we did.
But
signing
it was basically a free enterprise because the neighborhood association didn't want that half I offered them. They would have made a lot of money. And I sold the rights to Mike Beard. You may remember that Beard's Frame Shop. Mike's in the back of the building. He's had the rights to the poster ever since, and it still sells internationally. So it's in fact, I think it's in the in some museum back east. I can't remember. It's still a recognized poster. So.
I think we're about to close. The moderator. Oh, this gentleman has. We'll take one more, real quick.
Don't let this be ended up here.
Now, there's an outstanding citizen. I was no, that's really true. I've been wanting to tell you this. I'm going to send you a note, but there was this. Get up here. Anyway, I was in Powell's bookstore, and here was this magazine. There's a picture of Ted Gilbert there, and talking about this wonderful park he's got figured out in northeast Portland and everything. It's a wonderful, wonderful article, and I just want to let you know I read it, and you really impressed me, I'll tell you. Ted Gilbert.
Maybe this is something to close with. What are your memories of being on the Johnny Carson show?
Oh. Well, the green room, you know. You always watch Johnny Carson. I don't know if anybody here it's been a long time ago now, but my wife and I always used to watch it after I got off work, and the green room, you know, it's where you meet before the program and so forth. It comes from Shakespeare, I think, when the green room was in the lawn up next to the outdoor theater. But I always thought you'd go into the green room and you'd talk to Johnny and he'd tell you what you're going to talk about and so forth. You kind of get buddy, and boy, this is going to be a big deal. But that wasn't the way it was. Sigrid and I went in and we went in this room and then they sent it to the publisher and you don't see Johnny Carson until you get on that show. And they open that curtain and there you are. And then you come out on the stage and there's a few lights on us here, but there you can't see anything. The lights are so bright you can't even see the cameramen that are out there. And then you sit down, and I think this is still on these shows, you know, that are going on now, Letterman and so forth. You'll notice that they always have to turn around like this to talk to the host. So and the other people are kind of behind you too. So it's kind of like you're there, and it's a third degree, you know, and they're going to start the hot lights and everything. And I'd never been in a situation like that, but it all turned out right. That was part of putting Portland back on the map. They called up because here's this crazy guy that runs a tavern is going to be the mayor of a large city. And so they had to expose yourself to art. And the idea was to make fun of me or make fun of the situation, which is good. It's good to have humor, but the main idea as far as I was concerned was to get Portland back in the national focus and so that people would start thinking it's a good place to do business and so forth. So anyways, that feeling of being right there in the front.
Well, folks, before we close, moderator's prerogative, I promise to be brief. Let me tell you two quick closing thoughts. First is all of these other things, real accomplishments that occurred during this mayor's tenure with this help of his staff are for real. I'll tell you what struck me as a businessman as the most impressive one, which is when Bud Clark came into office, the city was basically broke. When he left office, the city had a substantial reserve.
$200,000. I mean, 10% of the general fund budget. 200,000. No, 200 million.
21.
21.
Who's counting? Million here, million there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money.
It was 20 million. It was 20 million. Frank had 27 million in reserves when he took office. 4 years later, it was down to $500,000. And when we left, we got a award from the AMBAC Corporation, which is they insure cities all over the world, and they gave us, I think it was the best run city of our size in the nation at that time. After 8 years. That's because we had a good committee. We had good counselors too. We got along together. We had goal setting sessions. We'd sit down and decide what direction the city was going to go the next year, set up the priorities. Then I'd assign the bureaus to the different commissioners, and we'd say wagons ho, and the bureaucracy would listen too, and everybody would be going in the same direction. And the bureaucracy is a great bureaucracy if you let them do their job. and let them use their imagination on getting things done and so forth. And don't tell them to do anything illegal. Make sure that it's going in the right direction.
Gosh, Bud, I think that's called leadership.
I would suggest that perhaps the current city government might learn a thing or two from the Bud's administration in regards to spending and using taxpayer dollars. And to wrap up, I want to make one other point, and that is much of the Portland that you see today really was started during this guy's administration. The doors got opened up again. People had an opportunity to contribute to their government and to talk back to it, if you will, on occasion. And that was a complete change of direction from the Ivancie administration, which was a very closed administration. And I think as you've watched Portland evolve over the last quarter century, I think the 2 terms of this gentleman had a lot to do with that. And with that, unless anyone else has anything, we're done.